tomorrow. The next agenda item is Commission and Council statements on detention and use of force against asylum seekers. On behalf of Council, Nicolas Schmit has the floor.
Okay. Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident. Mesdames et Messieurs les députés.
Honourable members, since the beginning of our presidency, we have been actively engaged in seeking solutions to the humanitarian crisis that has been provoked by migratory flows. We've shown resolution and determination. We need to act swiftly, show solidarity and respect human rights. The policy that Council has adopted is one which aims to combine our efforts to ensure that all those who deserve international protection can receive it, whilst we also improve checks at our external borders so that we can ensure we protect the safety of those and security of those on our territory. Migration policy and the common asylum system are at the heart of this. We need to give an effective response to the humanitarian crisis and ensure that international protection is granted in accordance with our international obligations. On detention, the basic law internationally and in the EU states that a migrant enjoys the right to freedom as any other person does. So detention can only take place on an exceptional and non-arbitrary basis. There are specific reasons which can justify it in specific circumstances. There is a detailed description of those circumstances in the acquis on asylum and migration, in the Returns Directive and in the Reception Conditions Directive. The general rule is that member states can only make use of detention once other, less coercive, appropriate measures have been used. That's Article 15, Para 1. Any detention should be as short in duration as possible and should not be extended whilst the expulsion provisions can be made use of. In the case of reception conditions for asylum seekers, Article 8 states that no one can be detained purely because they are claiming international protection. Detention can take place when necessary on the basis of a case-by-case analysis if other less coercive measures cannot be effectively applied. International commitments must be applied, as must the EU rules, which means that member states are required to respect the human rights of refugees and migrants, including the obligations contained within the directives. Should EU legislation not be applied correctly by a member state, then it would be incumbent upon the Commission, as guardian of the treaties, to take appropriate measures. In order to improve the efficiency of the EU's returns policy, the Commission has indicated on several occasions over the last few months that use of detention should be a last resort only. Detention should only be used if other measures are not possible. On the 9th of November last, Council decided that in the case of lack of cooperation by a migrant on arrival in the EU, that member states could in effect make use of the possibility granted them by the community acquis. In other words, use coercive measures and therefore the last resort measure of detention, provided that the duration is not excessive, and also with full respect for fundamental rights and the non-refoulement principle. Council's recent decision in relation to resettlement of 120,000 people from Italy and Greece has led to a situation where, if voluntary return is impossible and other measures in the Returns Directive are not appropriate in order to prevent secondary movements, then detention in accordance with the provisions of the directive can be applied as an emergency measure if effective. And in that context, I would point out that migrants do not have the right to choose the destination, and therefore that in order to achieve resettlement, their cooperation is required. In the case of use of force for fingerprinting, I refer to the checklist published by the European Agency of Fundamental Rights of the 22nd of October last, which should guide experts' work in that area in future. To conclude, detention continues to be an important issue. It should be stressed that detention should only ever take place on an exceptional basis. We'll be scrutinising this very carefully. The Court of Justice will be providing further clarification shortly. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Minister.
Thank you, Minister. And now, on behalf of the Commission, Commissioner Avramopoulos.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable members of the Parliament. Thank you. Honourable members of the Parliament, the Commission fully shares with the Parliament the objective of ensuring full compliance of our policies with human rights and human dignity. This was at the centre of the debate on the report just discussed some minutes ago on human rights and democracy. This is a key concern also when it comes to asylum seekers. Saying this, I turn now to the topic of the statement: detention and use of force against asylum seekers. The rights to liberty and the security of persons are fundamental human rights. The right to asylum is also a fundamental right. In past months, as you remember, we have put a lot of effort to communicate and deliver on all fronts that EU legislation has to be respected. And this means respect of all aspects of the asylum legislation. In this context, as long as there was a prior non-refoulement and proportionality check, countries can refuse entry to individuals who do not express a wish to apply for international protection. As you also know, we make efforts to ensure the proper registration of migrants, irrespective of their status, which is the precondition to appropriately managing the flows and setting the rights and duties of migrants. Let me clarify what EU law requires. With the recast directives on asylum adopted in co-decision, the EU acquis contains clear rules on detention of asylum seekers that strike the balance between those rights. It is therefore essential that persons are only detained in full compliance with these rules. Detention can only be applied as a measure of last resort and only after all alternatives to detention have been duly considered. We all agree that a person should never be detained for the sole reason that he or she is an asylum seeker. At the same time, when there is a significant risk of absconding, Member States should place a migrant in detention where that is necessary and proportionate. Moreover, the Directive on Reception Conditions provides that the detention conditions of asylum seekers must fully respect human dignity and meet their needs. Having a solid legal framework is only halfway through. The challenge now is to ensure a correct and coherent transposition and implementation of these rules. The Commission monitors closely the respect by Member States of the EU rules on detention. Member States had to transpose the Reception Conditions Directive by July 2015. The Commission has sent letters of formal notice to those Member States which did not communicate the transposition measures. In addition to legislation, the Commission pays attention also to Member States' practice in this field, in this area. The Commission has also provided guidance to Member States to facilitate systematic fingerprinting of migrants. The aim is to ensure a better management of migration flows via a better implementation of the Eurodac regulation while fully respecting the fundamental rights of the migrants. Dear honourable members of the Parliament, thank you for your attention. But I would like to ask your understanding because, as you know, the previous debate lasted more than planned and I have to catch the last flight to Berlin in half an hour from now. Thank you very much for your understanding. Commissioner Stylianides will replace me here.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we now hear the speakers for the political groups. The first group to speak is the European People's Party. Monika Hohlmeier for 2 minutes, please.
Herr Kommissar, liebe
Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much indeed for this brief overview. What's particularly close to my heart is that in the European Union there are a number of member states where human rights of refugees or economic migrants are not given enough attention. There's no reason or justification for undue violence from whomever, or for prison-type structures, or as the UNHCR describes, sometimes the situations are worse than prisons. Not enough food and drink, no medical provision, poor hygienic conditions, and sometimes tear gas used on a daily basis. That could happen in Greece, Hungary, Slovakia, or any EU member state. That cannot be. We need a critical exchange of views on who are asylum migrants or not, but whoever they are, they need to be treated properly. Then we can agree on procedures and all sorts of other questions, but that has to be guaranteed. In terms of mandatory registration, certainly very early we will need to work on intelligence. Young people and children have been trafficked and often misinformed. They're scared and they certainly don't want to be registered in any circumstances. That's why we need to educate children at a very early stage. There are very many children who have disappeared and they can fall victim to crime because they are exposed to a total lack of protection, and they're often used for the most evil schemes of illegal criminal organizations. Let's work together and be sensible on these issues.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Social Democrats, Mr. Salom Guerrero.
Thank you. If what Mr. Schmit and Mr. Avramopoulos have said to us, that freedom is fundamental, that detention is exceptional, that it's on a case-by-case basis, that there has to be a justification for it, that there is no other less coercive measure that is possible, that there are no returns, that human rights are respected, international law is respected. If all member states respected those things that you've said, we wouldn't be here discussing it. Unfortunately, it's not the case. Countries have been building fences, countries have been using aggressive behaviour towards refugees, and there are countries who are failing to respect these rights and who are using police violence. The aim is not to mistreat those who are being detained at that time. The aim is to send out a message to the countries of origin to achieve a deterrent effect so that more people won't come and request asylum. It's to dissuade people. You'll end up like them if you come here, is the message that's sent out. Dublin doesn't solve the problem. We all agree that we need to find new standards that will allow us to regulate this situation differently. The humanitarian principles that we supposedly have cannot be jettisoned when we're talking about protecting people who in some cases are fleeing war and death, and in other cases are fleeing hunger and death, sometimes an even more present threat than war. So we need to ensure that our asylum policy, which has been so wonderfully described by both Commission and Council, will actually be respected by all member states of the EU.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the ECR, Timothy Kirkup, a minute and a half.
President, I know I've already said it, I think, more than once this week, but properly implementing the rules we already have in place is the key to dealing with the challenges we face. And the more these challenges grow, the more we need those rules to be properly enforced. On dozens of occasions, I've stood in this chamber and pointed out that some member states have been getting away with flaunting those rules, and that includes long before the extent of the current crisis has hit us. We all know who those member states are, and we all know the Commission should have done far more before now in addressing these problems. We understand that funding and the ability of member states to allocate the necessary resources is, of course, proving very difficult. But that should never be allowed to stand in the way of basic human dignity and upholding the laws to which we are all subject. And this forms part of a wider discussion which we need to start having if we are to tackle the migrant crisis effectively. Border control, fingerprinting, processing upon arrival, and improving detention conditions, there are rules on all those issues. And it's high time the Commission started reminding certain member states in the strongest terms they have to play by them too. Lots of new ideas and new proposals are coming, but let's try to get things sorted out with those currently at our disposal before we move on any further.
Thank you very much. You have a blue card from Mr. Aker. Are you prepared to answer that? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. You talk about the migrant crisis. The migrant crisis could be settled if free movement was challenged head-on, and David Cameron had the opportunity for this with the renegotiation package. He said in his Bloomberg speech he was going to renegotiate free movement, and all of a sudden, when it's crunch time, he shied away from this. Why has he done this? Why has he given up the opportunity to settle this issue once and for all and cowed to the European Union?
Well, can I just say that's a bit pathetic, really. I haven't had time, President, to be able to talk more broadly on migration issues. I have absolute confidence in the leader of my party and the leader of the UK in negotiating matters which are to the benefit not only of the UK, but also in terms of the order which is necessary in the migrant situation in the European Union for the future. It's only rather sad that this sort of slanging which comes from extreme parties in my country really doesn't contribute at all to the major debate that we need to all have for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For 2 minutes now, on behalf of the Liberal Group, Cecilia Wikström.
The debate today is a very good opportunity to start putting facts back in a debate that is getting more and more surrealistic by the day. The most flagrant example is the proposal made by the President of the European Council, Mr. Tusk, who put forward the idea that all asylum seekers should be detained for 18 months to screen if they are potential terrorists. The most bizarre is that he does not seem to even realize that this would be completely against existing EU legislation. Let me say it again. The President of the European Council is proposing that all persons seeking refuge in Europe, fleeing from war and persecution, from the smallest baby to the oldest man or woman, should be put in prison-like camps for a year and a half. This echoes, Mr. President, the darkest periods in the European history that we do not wish to see again. I think that it is shocking to the point that I personally think that Mr. Tusk should be asked to publicly apologize for this. In media, we hear today talk about refugees illegally entering into the Union. This is a narrative that is not only dangerous, it is incorrect. It is not in any way illegal to enter a country in order to ask for asylum. This is a recognized human right in all of the EU's member states. Now, if we would work together, we would be able to offer shelter to those in need, but instead of that, rampant nationalism has taken over the public debate. This crisis has not been caused by refugees or the European institutions. It has been caused by nationalist governments and populists that are actively preventing a European solution for the situation. It's high time that we realize that the best way to do this, to solve the situation, is to do it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cecilia, you have a blue card from our colleague Kazimierz Ujazdowski. Are you prepared to answer that? Mr. Ujazdowski, please. No, not you, Mr. Buonanno. It's our colleague Ujazdowski up there.
Madam, I think you're very partial and untruthful in relating the words of the President of the European Council, saying that he's proposing a draconian procedure. But if you don't like what he proposes, what kind of procedure would you suggest? Because nobody will accept an automatic welcome of all the immigrants and qualifying them as refugees. What is your proposal that will provide security for Europe?
My proposal is very simple, and it goes for a large majority of the Libe committee in which I'm coordinator. It is a common responsibility sharing, a distribution key to member states, that is based on quantitative data such as population, GDP, employment rate, etc. And also it should be taken into account the countries that did most for refugees up until now, like Sweden, Germany, Austria and others. It is high time that the countries that did not participate stood up and took a full responsibility, because, you know, today it's a situation we have to handle. Tomorrow it will be a different situation, and we will all be stronger together.
On behalf of the left group now, for a minute and a half, José Juarez Jabons.
Thank you, President. 1 month ago, we were talking to a young Afghan on the border between Serbia and Bulgaria. Following his travels through Iran and Turkey, Belal, like many of his fellow Afghans, went through hell in Bulgaria. I would like to denounce abuse against refugees by the Bulgarian police. They've been subject to beatings and extortion. Oxfam, Amnesty International and the UNHCR, and we ourselves saw with our own eyes wounds, cuts and bruises. We saw people in appalling conditions. They were obliged to give their fingerprints and then they entered Serbia through Dimitrovgrad, where some of them were also subject to beatings and extortion. There seems to be a grim rule that refugees are detained, sometimes beaten up, and then their money and valuables are taken by the police. They are then sent to detention centres with appalling sanitary conditions and very little water and food. This is a group of Afghans trying to rest in a forest, and these are the conditions in a detention centre in Bulgaria. This is not acceptable in the EU or anywhere else in the world, but it is happening here in Bulgaria and other member states. We are seeing police violence, corruption, fences and returns at the border, inhumane conditions and an asylum policy that is not worthy of the name. These events are unacceptable and we demand there be an independent inquiry.
There's
a blue card from Mr. Japansky.
Thank you, President. Colleague, first of all, I think that these accusations are not true. This is calumny. I think that people who come from Afghanistan are not Syrians because they're Afghani. Let me now ask you, when was the last time that you went to the Bulgarian-Turkish border? When was the last time that you yourself saw what was happening there and what our border police has to handle? I have to say that this is an external border and they're protecting you from what is, for example, happening in Paris.
Thank you for your question. I'm sure Afghans would agree with me that they're people, human beings like anyone else. And it wasn't only Afghans who were the victims of this. It's not only GUI NGL that is saying this. Read the reports for yourself. Read the Oxfam report, the UNHCR report, the Amnesty International report, and then you'll see what the reality is.
Now, on behalf of the Greens, Mrs. Sargentini, for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, President. When we are talking about people who, for example, want to close borders, but people are simply trying to blame people. We have our own Donalds, the President of the Council. We have Donald Tusk, and our Donald said in the most influential newspaper in Europe in an interview that the migrants should first of all be retained for 18 months in order to screen them. And it's not just a question of curbing the flow of refugees, but we should take into account safety aspects, and we must retain immigrants for the period of screening. That is simply a sign of ignorance, and I am worried as to how Mr. Tusk views immigrants. He considers them a safety risk. There's not that difference between him and Trump. There's not such a difference between the two Donalds. Trump is met with opposition from his own conservative circles, and they say you can't talk about it like that and you can't stigmatize people like that. Article 1 of the Constitution forbids it. What about our governments, the heads of governments, Renzi, Cameron, Hollande and so on? What have they said? They haven't told our Donald, because this is not the way we can deal with refugees. We are creating fear in our amongst our citizens. You know the commissioners, you know the legislation, Mr. Schmit, but Donald doesn't. Can you tell us, Mr. Schmit, what it's all about? Who has been talking to, is Luxembourg behind this statement? It's something that we're going to hear at the summit. Is that going to be our Christmas present? President Tusk is legitimizing the states that are not doing anything. One thing is sure, however, the Council President cannot be expecting this before Christmas?
There's a blue card to you from Janice Atkinson. Happy to answer it? Okay, Janice.
Madam, do you not think that Renzi, Tusk and even Mr Cameron are actually listening to the people that they represent? They don't magic this out of the air. They're actually listening to their citizens' concerns. And I suggest that actually you start doing that too.
Before you answer what has not been a question, I should remind colleagues that the blue card procedure is for questions, not for statements. Well, my knowledge of the English grammar may be more limited than yours, but I had a hard time figuring out a question there. However, Judith is going to answer it.
I think the question is, do you not agree with me, madam? And the answer is, no, I don't. I think also your Prime Minister has a certain decency in himself, not going about saying that we should lock up every migrant that comes here. A decency that leads to not putting more fright in people. Fright that is illustrated by you, that will lead to more poverty and more terror in Europe. That's my opinion. Thank you.
And now, for 2 minutes on behalf of the EFDD, Diane James, please.
Thank you, sir. An aspect of the logic and coherency of the European Union's migration policy and resettlement programme is in the spotlight, in that we now have to deal with the direct consequences of Mrs Merkel's siren call to anyone, which has delivered unforeseen numbers seeking a home and a future within the European Union. Now, while some of those may be genuine asylum seekers and refugees, not yet identifiable and confirmable is those that are masquerading as such. Now, dictated quotas, unreasonable deadlines and relaxed processing systems to resolve the resettlement logjam have only exacerbated the problems caused by Mrs Merkel's ill-judged siren call. And the United Kingdom media and press has covered the instances of German and Swedish communities overwhelmed by resettled migrants with stories of arson, street violence and increasing crime levels. And in my own South East region in the United Kingdom, the proposed forced settlement of 200 migrants near to Chichester is viewed with fear, apprehension and trust. And that's totally understandable from a community of only purportedly 197 people. Now, the importance of national and citizen consent should be paramount, not overridden or ignored by European Union forced numbers imposition, a dictatorial policy and an ill-considered ultimate control over asylum and refugee resettlement. Now, where detention or force has happened, it is because the level of pressure has become more than a member state can bear or tolerate. The European Union needs to learn from its mistakes and also change direction completely. If you want newcomers to be welcomed, to smooth the process of acceptance and reintegration, stop the community backlash and halt the instances of violence, then stop immediately behaving like a dictator, tell Mrs Merkel to rescind her siren call and retract the freedom of movement principle. It's called getting a grip of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Für 1 Minute spricht jetzt im Namen der ENF-Fraktion Vicky Maeijer.
Vicky Maeijer for 1 minute.
Dank u, voorzitter. Honderdduizenden asielzoekers hebben het afgelopen jaar hun weg gevonden.
Thank you. Hundreds of thousands of asylum applicants have found their way to the EU, a real tsunami, and we're feeling the effects in the Netherlands. Since summer, we've had more refugees than in 2013 and 2014. We are a state under the rule of law. We treat people well, even if suspected of terrorism, who have begun asylum practices. The Party of Freedom believes that the security of our citizens is the priority. Checks have to be carried out. They have to be full checks. And if we can't do it, then the people must be expelled. But it should be our decision, not an EU decision. We think today it's high time for the Netherlands to close their borders.
Thank you. For 2 minutes, Mariya Gabriel.
Благодаря, господин председател. Беше цитирана България.
Thank you, President. Bulgaria's name has been mentioned here, and Bulgaria bears, of course, a great responsibility as being one of the external borders of the Union. And Bulgaria has been working in close cooperation with both European and international institutions and has been taking measures in accordance with European and international law. And there are 4 things to be noted in this respect. First and foremost, we must use the same single methodology in preparing monitoring reports assessing the national reception systems. And the reports mentioned here are not based on such a single methodology. And those who level accusations at the authorities must be quoted with their names. Secondly, the UNHCR and the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee are monitoring on a daily basis for the non-refoulement principle and its observance. In February 2015, the decision was made to make sudden inspections on the border, and these have not found anything untoward. And a guarantor for the non-refoulement principle is a Frontex officer who is present during all the procedures with citizens of third countries detained. You know, we must at least respect our own agencies such as Frontex. Furthermore, law enforcement officers go through special training for the granting of asylum purposes and are briefed and debriefed on a daily basis. And we must bear in mind the difficult conditions under which they are placed. Thirdly, the formal procedure to appeal against a member state for a breach of EU law requires a special document to be drawn up and directed to the appropriate national authorities for a response. This is the only way to achieve objectivity. And finally, our role here, colleagues, is key. Libe is sending delegations to the countries concerned on fact-finding missions. But above all, those countries, those member states that are making an earnest effort should be encouraged rather than vilified. Thank you.
Thank you. Josef Weidenholzer, 2 minutes.
Des Sommers 2015 werden uns
The summer 2015 will be of concern to us for some time. This was the biggest movement of refugees since the Second World War, and nothing will be the same again. We have seen wires that closed us in terms of camps and so on, and a lot could have been avoided if we had followed the rules we have wanted in this house for some time. In April we talked about a holistic approach. We talked about differentiating assessments, differentiate between migration, fleeing and displacement and so on. But for that we need different instruments, and the asylum procedure just seems to get lost in that context. And we need a speedy individual assessment of asylum cases. But in some circumstances it may be necessary to have retention. We have the reception directive, and we have also rules that it should not be a type of imprisonment. We have the protection of young children and minors, and of course we are against systematic use of violence. Why has this package not been implemented in some member states? I think you can make sense of this procedure, but we should ask ourselves how we can make this practicable. We should talk about humanitarian entry procedures, and we would avoid a lot of problems if we got that. We should also look at the way we deal with Turkey. What a problem will it be in the future if we are not dealing with Turkey in the proper way? Thank you.
Eine Minute, Helga Stevens, bitte.
Dank u, voorzitter. Beste collega's.
Thank you, President. Fellow members, following the Paris attacks, President Tusk said that illegal immigrants could be detained as long as possible in order to check on their identity. I think it is an unfortunate reality that one of the perpetrators had a false Syrian passport. Asylum seekers are not terrorists, but some terrorists do use the Balkan route alongside other migrants. Many refugees are coming from Syria, of course, and I think it is important to take account of the fact that you have people who are trying to travel illegally and they're being subject to identity checks. I don't see anything scandalous about that. If you have a lot of unidentified migrants, you need to identify them. Why aren't Italy and Greece acting more decisively? Why are our borders so porous? Why is the Commission looking the other way? We have an open wound.
Thank you. Nathalie Griesbeck, 1 minute. Thank you. How is it possible in the 21st century that we still have to explain to and remind European states in the cradle of democracy that you can't detain children who are fleeing war and atrocity, the sort of thing none of us has ever experienced? I think that's unacceptable. The right to freedom and the right to protection against arbitrary detention are fundamental human rights and are enshrined in the Universal Declarations of Human Rights and apply without exclusion to all humans. Now, it's just been pointed out to us that refugees are being detained. Some report violence, brutality, secret detention. Colleagues, I'd like to hear an explanation of how the President of Council, Mr. Tusk, who speaks for us and represents us all, was able a few days ago barely to say that refugees should be detained for up to 18 months after their arrival in Europe. To avoid trampling our values underfoot and the fundamental values that we wave in speeches, we must work together on efficient inspections at borders, and we must ensure that dignity applies to all in Europe and beyond. Thank you.
Buonasera a tutti.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. The next speaker is Mrs. Björk for 1.5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Together with the GUE delegation, we went to the Balkan area, and we met interpreters there and border police and so on. We saw what people who are fleeing have been through, conditions that nobody should go through. They are entitled to a good reception in Europe. They are not illegal, and they should not be locked up, and they should not be subject to violence. But however, we have seen evidence of what is happening to them in Turkey. There's a report on that, and young people are sometimes treated in conditions that they think they have actually been imprisoned. And we've heard about police brutality in Bulgaria and so on. So my question to the Commission and the Council is, what are you going to do to stop this? Is it so that the police of a member state rob refugees and use violence? Will you keep just turning your backs? Are you going to go upon the Commission and our member states to stop using the Dublin conditions to young people who have been subject to this kind of violence? I want a specific answer, because if you don't do anything, we will, instead of giving protection, will simply continue providing violence, and we will continuing the trauma that nobody should be allowed to experience.
Mrs. Björk, there's a question for you. Will you accept it?
Il y a une question pour vous.
There's a question for you. Will you accept it? From Mr. Buonanno.
I don't take, because it's a waste of my time. They have no
non la vuole
for the
accettare.
future.
Benissimo. Grazie. Onorevole Keller.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Keller, 1 minute, thank you.
Colleagues,
È diritto dei deputati, secondo il regolamento.
Members are entitled, according to the rules of procedure, to decide whether to accept the question. If they don't want to accept it, they're not obliged to. Mrs. Keller.
Look at President Tusk's job description, and helpfully he publishes it on the website, and there it reads, he's supposed to help to facilitate cohesion and consensus within the European Council. Now, I'm not sure Mr. Tusk looks at this job description and website therefore very often, and maybe he should, because the interview that he's been given to The Guardian and other newspapers surely wasn't very helpful in this regard. And President Tusk, unfortunately, also doesn't seem to be very firm on EU legislation, or else he wouldn't have made proposals that go against European law and also against any sort of humanitarian census. But then again, guardian of the treaty, it's not his task, it's the task of the Commission. So I'm very sure that Mr. Juncker had a good talk with Mr. Tusk, and that we will in future be hearing more, let's say, consensual and more forward-bringing issues and descriptions from our President of the Council. Thank you.
Grazie. Onorevole Ferrara.
Thank you. Ms. Ferrara, 1 minute, please. Thank you. President, the EU is now facing the challenge of balancing freedom and security. Security can be an instrument to achieve freedom and ensure guarantees of freedom. That balancing act is very difficult. We tend to be prioritizing security and sometimes sacrificing freedom. It's difficult to identify asylum seekers and genuine refugees, and that is something which can be a problem for European citizens and indeed the citizens of third countries who are seeking asylum. The answer is not the use of force. The answer is not administrative detention. We've seen in Italy some very negative examples of expulsion centres, reception centres, kinds of lager, where in fact the conditions in which immigrants are kept are not conducive to a good outcome. The Five-Star Movement is calling for humanitarian corridors, revision of Dublin, and people should be identified as soon as possible so that we can have greater security for European citizens and the citizens being welcomed here.
Onorevole Bizzotto per un minuto.
1 minute, Mrs. Bizzotto. Thank you, President. When we talk about immigration, Europe always says the same thing. It talks about welcome and integration. Under the tragic Alfano, Italy has thrown the borders open to illegal immigrants who aren't all refugees. What can we do? Italy can't manage hundreds of thousands of refugees, and we are penalised for our inadequate conditions. The Commission and the Italian government are both doing badly. Why don't we do something over in Africa? Why don't we distribute the refugees throughout the EU, stopping them falling into the hands of human traffickers working through Italy? The Italian government is now unable to deal with an unfettered invasion now. Commissioner, I don't think penalties against Italy will help. I don't think what is being done now will help stop terrorists or people escaping war. Everything seems to be given free of charge to migrants, whereas Italian families get nothing. Should we treat migrants like they're on holiday? No. 2 minutes, Mr. Radev.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, in many of its reports, the European Commission has pointed out that Bulgaria is a sure guard of the borders of the European Union. The area of our border with Turkey is characterized by a difficult, rough terrain, which is very difficult to negotiate. The Bulgarian border police are working in difficult conditions. They dismantle traffickers' networks, capture criminals, potential terrorists, and save migrants who have crossed the border and are in need of help. But despite all these efforts, Bulgaria again stands wrongly accused by foreign NGOs of abusing asylum seekers. I would like to emphasize that none of the investigations of the methods of the Bulgarian border police support the allegations. The illegal crossing of the country's border outside the established border checkpoints makes it possible for members of Islamist terrorist organizations to penetrate into Bulgaria and the EU. This is why Bulgaria is taking and will continue to take all strict measures allowed by national and international law, and will continue to control the flow of illegal migrants and refugees. I would like to appeal to all those who criticize the countries at the external borders of the EU. Please get acquainted with the conditions in which our border guards are working before accusing us. And please do not interview only asylum seekers. Please speak to people who meet thousands of migrants day in, day out. And only then write your reports, please.
Thank you. Mrs. Iotova, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. In 2015, this year, we wrote up a lot of documents. We never stopped talking about this strategy and another to tackle the refugee crisis, but we forgot the most important thing, the human face of this crisis. The numerous conflicts and wars are somehow diverting our attention from a simple human story, from a human tragedy. But none of this would have happened if the measures we were proposing already at the beginning of this year had been fulfilled. And the member states somehow felt on their own, left alone, and they started raising walls and barbed wire. Dublin is long gone. It doesn't work. The temporary relocation mechanism has stalled. The so-called hotspots are not yielding the expected results. The criteria of relocation are not clear, and we have only today heard of a new idea to set up a new way of relocating 80,000 Syrian refugees per year in Europe. On the same time, a lot of the immigrants, the refugees, would not live on the external border, on the periphery of the Union. They would head immediately for Western and Northern Europe. And this all results in animosities. And I'm going to tell something now to these who mentioned Bulgaria more than once. The wrongest message you could make today is to point a finger at one state or another. We're all facing the same difficulties. We're all in it together. And it is not abuse or violence when you have to take somebody's fingerprints or when you have to process an application. These are European norms and standards that you here have voted. And when a country such as Bulgaria follows those, it should not be accused of violating human rights. And there are other monitoring reports every year, of course, you know, about how countries manage the refugee crisis. Bulgaria has not been criticized in any of these monitoring reports thus far. And when we call names and call people haters and xenophobes and all that, that is only grist to the...
Mr. Jambaski, 1 minute.
At the basis of this yet another useless debate are several reports that are full of slander and falsehood. And I refute them categorically. These can only be written up by people who are either of bad will or have never seen that border or do not even know where that border between Bulgaria and Turkey is. It is not only Bulgaria's border, by the way, it is an external border of the Union, and Bulgaria has the duty to protect that border in the interest of Bulgarians and the rest of Europe. But there is something else that catches my eye in this debate. An increasing number of colleagues, apparently, do not understand what it is all about and keep telling us things that have got nothing to do with real life. Everybody who would qualify taking fingerprints as violence doesn't really know what they're talking about. And once again, addressing to people who are suffering some sort of split personality syndrome here. Those who want to protect legal migrants, let them take them by plane.
Thank you. Mr. Dzhambazki, there is a blue card for you. Will you accept it?
Allora, onorevole Fountoulis, prego.
Go ahead, sir.
Colleague, I would like to ask you, do you agree that these complaints are instigated by non-governmental organizations and lawyers who make benefit despite the migrants?
Mr. Dzhambazki for an answer.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. As you see, unlike other colleagues who casting aspersions here, we're not afraid to answer one question or another. Yes, we believe so. There are organizations that are serving ulterior interests and motives, and they would rather not own Chancellor Merkel as their own.
Mr. Mlinar, 1 minute.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident. Mich beunruhigt.
Thank you. I'm worried about the fact that certain member states criminalize asylum applications knowledgeably, because there is thereby no legal possibility of applying for asylum. So they have not committed a crime, and nevertheless we imprison them. But the Human Rights Convention has said that this can only be used as a large procedure in the procedure of asylum. And to imprison people for the purpose of identification or fingerprint measures is not acceptable. We have seen dramatic situations with people who need protection, and even children, apart from the fact that this kind of treatment causes huge costs, and where the officials face a moral dilemma because they see people who have not committed a crime and nevertheless they need to be detained. We must change this practice and therefore make sure that we treat the refugees in a human way.
Thank you. Mrs. Spinelli, 1.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. Reading the Commission's communication on Italian hotspots, Rome should provide a legal basis for the use of force for taking fingerprints and for lengthy detentions. It's difficult to achieve this without violating 2 articles of the Constitution. So the legal experts, how can we deal with detention and violence against refugees when this is taking place in Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, France, Spain to an ever greater extent? In Italy, forced expulsions, forced returns are also taking place even when a judge has suspended repatriation. The Danish government will be confiscating refugees' jewellery, with the exception of wedding rings, in order to pay for their costs. This kind of measure is being put forward as something that's necessary in an emergency in order to save Schengen. President Tusk is saying that 18 months detention is okay to save Schengen. Non-refoulement, habeas corpus, non-coercive measures on vulnerable people or minors are all going by the wayside. Repressive measures are being used when there are in fact binding discretion clauses. Is that the price of Schengen? Then I say no thanks. I don't have the slightest hesitation as a citizen in saying I don't need Schengen in that case.
Joly. Thank you. Mrs. Joly, 1 minute please. Thank you, President. Commissioner, the destiny of refugees seems not to move anyone anymore, and what's worse, the President of Council has gone for a dangerous security measure to play to the populist gallery, which we hear everywhere, especially in Europe. I'm not sure what I'm most shocked by, that Mr. Tusk is talking about the potential detention of migrants for 18 months on security grounds, or the fact that the request by the Greens for him to explain himself in plenary was torpedoed by other groups. There's nothing to be said, it seems. On migrants, then, you can say what you like, you can propose what you like and do what you like. In Europe, the walls are going up one by one, but the dike has burst, the dam has burst. And that's a message that's going to European citizens. International rights, humanitarian rights and solidarity are over. Now it's borders, security, war. We criminalise a little more migration, human rights recognised under international law nonetheless. That's Europe in 2015. I say it to you today, we will need to transcend good wishes and intentions and guide Europe back into the right path.
Winberg, per un minuto.
Thank you. 1 minute for Mrs. Winberg.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you very much, President. Obviously, detention and force is something you should avoid for as long as possible, but we should be aware of the fact that many of those who seek asylum in Europe do not have guilty reasonable reasons for doing so, and people are sort of cheating to get in. For example, they don't wish to leave fingerprints and so on, which means they sabotage the whole process, and they won't really seek asylum wherever they're supposed to be, and we must be able to detain such people and use force against them to return them, and we must have a possibility of releasing a reasonable level of force so that we can make them respect the decisions that are taken. The truth is that many of them cheat and exploit our systems. We must make sure that we catch these people out, and the use of force must be part of the tool set that we have so that we can make sure that we spot these people who are cheating.
Atkinson, per un minuto.
1 minute for Mrs. Atkinson, please.
I would actually like to see more detention, particularly in Calais. Every day we receive reports about violent and aggressive migrants, some with jihadist backgrounds, including the Paris attackers. In Calais, British truck drivers are threatened and attacked on a daily basis whilst trying to do their job. We hear appalling stories of British lorry drivers who are threatened with weapons including knives, baseball bats and even guns. Their safety and lives are at risk. Hundreds of migrants arriving in Norway have been found with jihadi pictures on their cameras. Who's checking the Calais migrants? Nobody has a clue what these migrants are doing in the Calais jungle. When are the French authorities finally get to act against these criminals that are threatening the safety of our citizens? Do they really want to risk the first truck driver getting killed before the authorities take appropriate action? If police forces aren't able to control the situation, make the army step in to ensure security in Calais, just as they do in the rest of France. If the Front National had won the Calais region last weekend, then a better solution would have been found for the lawlessness in the Calais jungle. Those migrants that commit criminal acts need to be arrested, detained and deported straight away before it is too late.
Grazie. Onorevole Zdechovský.
Thank you. Zdechovský, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Commissioner, colleagues, I would like to thank you all for opening up this topic and for this very interesting debate. This is a reflection of what is happening in our societies. We all do not agree on things in the same way. We do not see things in the same way. There is not one single truth. It is important what point of view we take. But before we start criticizing anyone, we have to admit that we made a mistake, all of us. We bend the rules, all of us, one way or the other. Only after we make this admission we can deal with the refugee crisis. We are speaking about the terrible situation of asylum seekers who are waiting at our external borders or even within EU. Their situation is very difficult, that's for sure. But why is that? Who are these people and how do they act? Do they always succumb to all rules? I could talk at length about experiences from refugee camps at borders. We have heard a lot about that. Much has been said about that. There are always some people who will try to circumvent the rules, who don't want to take the process diligently. And any detention is, of course, should be a subject of discussion, and we have to take and weigh all perspectives. I would like to call upon all of you not to be only critical. Let us all think about how to address this situation in a positive way to the benefit of the people who need our help.
Thank you, Mr. Szanyi. 2 minutes. Go ahead, Tibor.
Grazie, Presidente.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this chamber, and not only here, but in general, in the media environment around the Parliament, I think this is a timely debate. However, the European public debate is much more complicated, relevant, and tough. If we read the central media, there may be diverging views, but this horrible narrative which some governments instigate, for instance the Hungarian government, may sound very strange to some ears, but those governments used partly EU funds to build fences and to pursue a government propaganda on the public radio and television, instigating fear in everybody, suggesting that people should build up self-defense because they are ahead of enormous threats. So we need to unite the rules and also enforce those rules to dispel any such propaganda. And I would also like to mention the PNR rule. It is impossible that European citizens are made subject to all kinds of security scrutinies and rules, whereas hundreds and thousands of people can cross without any kind of control, and I've seen people coming in and also exiting the EU without any kind of control. So there is need for some uniform rule which is to be observed by all. Thank you.
Honorable Halla-aho.
Thank you. Halla-aho, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. One important defect in our migration policy is that Europe is unable to return those people whose asylum application has been rejected. It is clear that this fact encourages the use of the asylum system as a channel of economic migration. In most cases, applicants wait for the decision in open reception facilities. When they learn that their application has been rejected, they very often disappear and remain in the Schengen area as illegal immigrants. Sometimes they vanish from reception centres before they are even registered and fingerprinted. All this undermines the credibility of the asylum system. It would be a good idea to always detain asylum seekers for as long as their case is being processed. If this is against the existing EU law, then we should change that EU law. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Onorevole.
Thank you. Ms. Bagasa Urtundua, 1 minute. Thank you, President. The parents of Jesus of Nazareth fled Egypt fled the massacre of the innocents. If we'd depended on Ms. Bizzotto or Ms. Anderson, then Jesus wouldn't have been born even in a stable. He would have been deported, and Mary would have given birth outside the stable, and probably the child would have perished. So to the cold-hearted I say, if you don't share the suspicion that fundamental human rights may be being violated when people are fleeing war, then I would say that you should be held responsible for that. You should look into that and act with the maximum severity. Mr. Juncker has said what we are willing to tolerate and the history that we are willing to write. I don't want to be an accomplice of that kind of history being written.
Anderson, per 1 minuto e 30.
Mr. Anderson, a minute and a half, please.
Thank you. Give me your huddled masses yearning to breathe free is written proudly on the base of the Statue of Liberty. What would be written if she stood in Lampedusa? Maybe get in line, prepare for internment and deportation or return to war zones. Fortress Europe wants authorities to forcibly register and detain asylum seekers to protect the failed Dublin regulation, identify hotspots and deploy rapid response units. The EU is complicit in serious human rights abuse. Yesterday, Amnesty International published a report condemning how Turkey has unlawfully apprehended, detained and pressurised refugees and asylum seekers to return to war zones. Hungary and Bulgaria are no better. Europe is not faced with a deadly invasion. Refugees are people like you and me who, along with their children, are fleeing desperate conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, conflicts made worse by bombs of member states. Offering simple, safe and legal routes and de-escalating conflict will help alleviate the conflicts and the crisis. From 1892, Ellis Island, without computers, neither internet nor modern-day sophistication, offered safe and legal access to millions. So I leave you with a quote from an Irish conservative philosopher, Edmund Burke, who says the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Grazie.
Thanks, Mrs. Anderson. Please, colleagues, do you respect your speaking time? I'm trying to give people a few extra seconds, but we are in a difficult position time-wise. Mrs. Hautala, 1 minute, please.
Mr. President. The President of the European Council should facilitate bringing together different member states' positions in order to find sustainable and humane solutions. He should also stand up to common European values, and she should not give way to using his position as a tool for advancing national politics. His proposal to detain refugees arriving to the EU for 18 months goes not only against EU law but also against international law. Talk of detaining refugees further deepens the gaps and divisions between member states and is thus very harmful during times when common EU asylum and migration policy is needed. Instead of populist responses like this, a comprehensive approach is needed to tackle the humanitarian crisis the world is currently facing.
Mr. Bay, 1 minute, please.
10 days after the attacks of the 5th of November, 2 committees from the European Parliament dared to vote in an accelerated procedure text which aim is to facilitate the putting down of complaints by illegal immigrants. While the Commission has told us there's going to be more than 3 million new illegal immigrants between now and 2017, both the right and left in this hemicycle adopted on the 2nd of December a resolution which encourages illegal immigration. In fact, this text aims at preventing the border guards from doing their work by encouraging the non-documented immigrants to complain. Worse, the NGOs who have been hugely subsidised have now turned into their job the protection of these strangers, and they can actually launch now legal procedures while these immigrants are in fact entering illegally in our countries. Well, our priority ought to be to give safety and prosperity to the Europeans, but again you continue to privilege the migrants, in other words the others, before our own. This is to this, you've added the irresponsibility of asking us to all drink a glass of champagne in order to adopt this terrible resolution. Well, while you're sniffing a champagne bubbles, it's our fellow citizens who are going to be suffering. Thank you.
Chinnici per 2 minuti, ne ha facoltà.
Ms. Chinnici for 2 minutes, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Il pubblico è bene.
Obviously, an audience is welcome. You can do anything except for applauding or demonstrating approval or disapproval of what honourable members say. It's very serious that people are not respecting that rule, and I would ask our services on the gallery to do something. So, Ms. Chinnici, 2 minutes, please. Yes, thank you, Mr. President. The commitment to managing migrant flows, which are particularly significant in some member states, has been marked by actions on various fronts to make certain that all migrants have the best possible reception, as well as refugees and asylum seekers. The requisite controls carried out in centres in Europe need to be done while respecting rights and carried out as expeditiously as possible, because that's the only way we can battle traffickers and other exploiters and stop terrorism. We need to make certain that the laws which are applicable are properly applied. We need to make certain that human dignity and the fundamental rights of individuals are respected too, so that we don't see a situation of people held in unfair conditions for longer than the statutory limit, because of the psychophysical damage that this can cause. European legislation needs, and all in member states, needs to be in line with the legislation in force on human rights, and measures which countermand this can only be used as a last resort. We need to look at the question of complaints and about possible human rights violations of people held in reception centres, bearing in mind the possible role that the European Ombudsman can play. I think the new European Coast Guard, which is about to be set up, needs to be able to help protect the fundamental rights, which it can do by working closely with all stakeholders and make certain that vulnerable individuals such as minors, particularly unaccompanied minors, are protected right from the start. They run the highest risk of falling victim to organised crime. Thank you, Ms. Chinnici. Now we turn to Mr. Henkel for 1 minute.
I've been a member of Amnesty International for many years, and I was delighted today that much has been said about the rights of refugees today, a lot of which was correct. I think it's a scandal how often refugees are attacked in my country and refugee asylum centres are attacked. But in the interests of those who have the right to remain in the country, we do have to talk about their duties. Refugees who stand at the EU borders and destroy their identity documents or give false information about their identity, that do continue to exercise and express their ethnic conflicts with violence within our borders, must be returned home. Also, for those that are to stay, integration is not just a matter of a one-way street from Europeans, but it is also something that the refugees have to accommodate themselves, and this is a message I think the High Representative should take on board.
Mr. Henkel, there's a blue card from Mr. Buonanno for you. Could you accept it, sir? Mr. Buonanno.
Yes, I want to thank our colleague. You're much more democratic than the colleague who spoke before. I want to ask you, I'm absolutely in agreement on what you've just said about the current situation, but would you be in agreement to actually do a kind of Guantanamo somewhere in Europe?
As a member of Amnesty International, I have always sought to have the prison in Guantanamo closed, and my answer therefore to your question is no.
Mr. Chrysogonos for 1 minute, please. In the last few weeks, President, we have seen a multiplication of complaints to international organisations which protect human rights about ill treatment of refugees and migrants by the police forces in southeastern European member states as well as Turkey. The European Union, however, needs to protect its statutory values, that's to say fundamental rights and the rule of law, and condemn violations of them no matter who carries these violations out. We shouldn't forget that refugees aren't criminals. They've left their homelands because of fear of persecution or searching for a better life. While we protect our external borders, which is vitally important if we're going to prevent criminal activity, and we need to protect, however, fundamental rights at the same time. And also, the Union needs to throw all its weight behind trying to achieve peace and normality in its neighbourhood, particularly the Middle East, whilst respecting international law so as to stop people becoming migrants in the first place. Thank you, Mr. Chrysogonos. Anna Gomes. 2 minutes. The question of refugees is something which Mr. Tusk said was a shame on the European Union, and problems because of the already existing unemployment figures in Europe are making it more difficult for people to want to receive refugees here. There's also the question of foreign fighters, though people tend to forget that these foreign fighters are very often European, and these austerity policies are things which only make areas like Molenbeek worse. And in the last few months we've not seen enough attempts made recently to improve the reception centres, the hotspots, and to process asylum seekers more rapidly. The refugees which we have a legal and moral obligation to receive, and people whose economic and social circumstances are so bad that they want to come to our society, need to be handled in a humane and proper way, and we need at the same time to make sure that people are treated fairly in the Union no matter where they come from. The massive wave of refugees and asylum seekers has simply led, because of mismanagement in Europe, to huge profits for the traffickers in human beings, and the channels which have been created are being ignored by our governors. It's not possible to check every single metre of Europe's border, every single metre of Europe's coast. We need to make sure that we can do something about the refugee crisis, but at the moment we're not helping the refugees and we're not keeping our citizens safer either. We need to be able to do something to prevent further terrorist attacks while simultaneously helping those asylum seekers. Thank you. Mr. Krasnodebski, for 1 minute, please.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Chair. I think that some of our colleagues actually, when they talk about law, what they really mean is anarchy, and they're actually losing any sense of reality. I'd like to ask the representative of the Commission and the Council, how do you think that the mechanism is going to work without use of any force? How are you going to take the digital fingerprints? The relocation process can't take place without that occurring. The refugees are going to be stopped in the countries where they don't want to live. As we all know, they don't want to live in Poland or Lithuania. They want to live in Sweden or in Germany. Mr. Zuber, please.
The use of force against asylum seekers is shameful, as is the use of force against migrants in general. It's not a question of trying to select those refugees who are willing to suffer violence or not. People who are going through Bulgaria are people who need to be protected from those who wish to set dogs on them or fire weapons in their direction. And the way in which, for example, Turkey has used force against Syrians has led them now to start putting Syrian refugees in secret areas and secret camps. The boats which are transporting refugees have often been boarded by force by various coast guards. Are these forces belonging to the European Union or member states? Thank you.
Post per 2 minuti.
Ms. Post, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin with an assertion. Nobody is an illegal. The discussion on refugee policy in the EU is not beneficial of our view of other people. The statement that we have to strengthen our borders and that the EU must put a ceiling on the number of people fleeing, that we're talking about the volumes of fleeing people, make it easy for us to forget human dignity, which we must always retain sight of. And we have a responsibility to lead and not to give way to emotions. So it's important to think how people are treated, not least in the border areas. We know that people who are fleeing may be criminals and they cross borders. This is illegal, and every country is responsible to make sure that human rights are upheld for all individuals that are on their territories. And it is illegal to deprive people of their freedom without good cause. It is illegal to use violence against people who wish to exercise their right to seek asylum. It is illegal not to treat people as humans. The EU has a responsibility in this issue. We have a common asylum policy, and the Commission has to ensure that countries follow that legislation. We need supervision of countries and the EU border authorities that will work in a preventive way and also help with appeals, and the EU authorities must prioritize human rights being upheld in their work and to help spread good practice in this domain. And if we don't manage to treat people who are fleeing as people, then sooner or later it will be our own human dignity that will be lost.
Thank you, Mr. Huntis, for 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, in 2015 we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration, and what we're seeing now is war and waves of refugees. The police beating refugees, the barriers, the so-called hotspots. These things are all shameful for the European Union and its member states. It's showing that we're in a very dark period for Europe, and no European citizen wants to see anything like this. The Dublin Convention is being violated every day, and the question is, for the present and the future of Europe, because of the decisions that have been taken, seems to be even less impressive. Is Frontex going now to become a body which examines asylum seekers? Are we going to allow police forces in Europe to mistreat refugees? And what happens with people's rights? The tragic truth is that we are really on the border now of respecting human rights in Europe, and its member states are often not doing so. The political responsibility, I think, lies with the European Union and its member states. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now it's time for Catch the Eye. I've got 5 names down on my list. Mr. Jakovčić is first of all. Go ahead, sir. 1 minute.
Grazie, signor Presidente. Ono što trebamo jednostavno si reći je da je svih nas iznenadila ova migrantska kriza.
So we have to deal with these waves of immigrants at the moment, and in this particular context we find ourselves having to improvise and sometimes taking decisions which actually aren't systematic. what we've got to say is that the Dublin system no longer exists. It's an empty page. That's very clear. What's happening at the moment is because we were not ready. We're not ready to deal with everything that is happening, what has happened on the Hungarian border, or that is currently happening on the Slovenian border with Croatia. We cannot accept what Mr. Tusk says. The declarations are completely unacceptable. I do hope that countries such as Croatia and Serbia and Macedonia, who have done a great deal for the arrival of migrants, will in fact be compensated for this, because everyone has got a right to liberty.
Mr. Marias, thank you, President. Greece has been, of course, a receiver for thousands of refugees. A large number of refugees have moved to my country and through my country. And only a week ago, on the border with Skopje, people have been coming through. The island of Mytilene is also the venue for many incidents involving refugees. Many people have been making tremendous efforts to show hospitality to the arriving refugees, but the number of refugees has been multiplying as soon as Mrs. Merkel invited refugees to come to Germany. We've now had over 160,000 refugees in Greece, and only a total of 2,000 have been have had their proposals and request process, and only 20 odd have been actually rehoused. Thanks very much, Mr. President. Ms. Morvai, for 1 minute, please.
Kiváló párhuzamot használt.
Thank you. There was a parallel drawn by one of my colleagues in Hungary at a conference. He said, let's imagine a wealthy company, and that company is based in a very luxurious palace and has a large foreign delegation that arrives, and the doorkeeper happens to be in this villa over the weekend, and the doorkeeper rings up and the owners of the company say, no problem, please take the guests to their rooms, make sure that they have a good time. This is what happened with the country where our country, where 200 or 300 euros went this way and that way, and then the boss, Mrs. Merkel in Germany, invited millions of refugees to come, and the countries now find themselves in a very difficult situation.
Mr. Tomasic, for 1 minute, please.
Često smo tijekom ove krize raspravljali o pravima izbjeglica.
So the crisis has made us think about refugees and the asylum rights, but now we finally got to start talking about some of the obligations which go alongside these rights. And one of the key ones is obviously going to be the respect of constitutions and the laws of the member state where these people are asking for asylum find themselves to be. Now, I'm aware of the fact there are terrible situations that these refugees are fleeing, and I know that some of them are nevertheless not used to our way of life, to the rights that go alongside and the responsibilities that go alongside our way of living. So what are we going to do to ensure they actually fulfill the laws, because laws got to be equal for everyone? It's currently the case that the legal environment is pretty much chaotic, but what we cannot do is simply suspend our own laws or to tolerate the non-respect of law. All those people who wish to come and live in Europe have got to ensure that they go through their own acclimatization to our way of life. It must start immediately when they put their foot in the territory.
Line per un minuto, prego, ne facoltà.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. What we've heard about the detention of asylum seekers and the use of force against them is very worrying. I went to an identification expulsion centre in Italy, and I saw that the people who arrived aren't informed properly about their rights, indeed the right to asylum. They are divided and discriminated against on the basis of their nationality and on the possibility of returning them, and they can be held, in fact, for over a year. The conditions are very bad. There are minors who shouldn't even be there, and there is a simple taking of their pulse, which is a medical checkup, which is simply utterly inadequate. What we need to do is give these people some hope for the future. So the failing to implement Dublin, it really needs to be addressed. Thanks very much, says the President, Mrs. Schlein. That's the end of Catch the Eye, and now I turn to Commissioner Stylianides. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, thank you so much for this very fruitful debate, very constructive, very productive discussion. You know that my dear colleague Dimitris Avramopoulos, who is in charge in this subject, in his opening remarks, he has already covered all aspects of this very challenging matter. Few words only. The Commission is taking action to ensure full compliance with EU law in the area of asylum, and the right to asylum is a fundamental right, and of course this means respect of all aspects of the asylum legislation. This is very important. The Commission during the last semester has sent 4 reasoned opinions, 42 letters of formal notice and 8 administrative letters in the field of asylum concerning the implementation of the Eurodac regulation and the transposition of and compliance with the recast asylum procedures and reception conditions directives. I would like to stress and to focus on this. The right to asylum is a fundamental, and of course this means respect of all aspects of the asylum legislation. And the Commission remains fully committed to ensure respect by Member States of human rights and dignity when they apply European Union law. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Commissioner. Now I give the floor to Mr. Schmit on behalf of the Council. Go ahead, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, MEPs, I don't want to turn myself into an interpreter of the comments of the President of the European Council, but I read in the letter that he sent out for the European Council tomorrow, and here I am quoting in English.
The protection of our external borders is not intended to scare off those who flee wars or persecution. Europe is a community of freedom and will always provide shelter for those in danger.
As the Commissioner did, I set out the law in this area, and it's clear that the holding of people who are asking for asylum cannot be interpreted as the rule. And if there is any abuse, if there are any situations as such, the European rules, which have just been stated again by the Commissioner, or indeed the international rules, if they're not respected, then measures have got to be undertaken, because human dignity and human rights cannot be violated. And as we are a little bit in this crisis situation, Well, it would perhaps be proper to read once again our fundamental texts, the very texts that make the European Union what it is and what it should be. These texts are the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the first article, the very first article of this charter, what does it say? It says that human dignity is inviolable. It must be respected and protected. And what does Article 18 say? It says that the right to asylum is guaranteed in the respect of the rights of the Treaty of the Geneva Convention. So that's what's stated. And of course, everyone has got to respect our rules, our laws, including those who ask for asylum. Thank you. Thank you. You're going to be with us in the next debate. I've got to make a very important announcement to the room. Following the Rule 198, the Rules of Procedure, the Conference of Presidents has received a request by 283 members to set up a committee of inquiry on the emission measurements in the automotive sector. Now, at this meeting this afternoon, the Conference of Presidents took note that the request had indeed been validly submitted by more than 1/4 of the Parliament's component members, and it decided to submit to plenary a proposal for a decision to set up a committee of inquiry, its powers, its numerical strength, and its term of office. The proposal for the decision, which is the following term B81424/2015, is available on the Parliament's website. The House will therefore vote on this proposal at the beginning of voting time tomorrow. Any amendments to the proposal of the Conference of Presidents relating to the numerical strength of the Committee of Inquiry may be tabled by 8 o'clock tonight, 2000 hours. The House will vote on the appointments to the Committee of Inquiry on the 19th of January 2016. Thank you. And now we have declarations. Mariya.
Yes, President, I've listened to your announcement that we've got this proposal which we have to amend only by 20 hours tonight, 8 p.m. That's really a very small amount of time, less than 1 hour. And I don't think it's democratic. It's not really a proper parliamentary procedure. I think we need to have a sufficient amount of time. But if you're telling us that we have to make a specific proposal within 1 hour when we won't be able to talk together, I think you should look at this again, sir.
Well, we don't actually have any possibility to have a debate on this, as you know, in the sense of the regulation. And this decision was taken by the Conference of Presidents, which had actually also set down what the timescale was for the presentation of any amendments. And of course, in terms of the decisions of the Conference of Presidents, well, here all we can do is note it down. I'm sorry for that, but the debate is closed. And now we are looking for a declaration by the Vice President and the High Representative of External Affairs on the issue of the 20th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Agreement. So I'll give the floor to Mr. Schmit for the Vice President of the Commission, the High Representative. The floor is yours, Minister.
Honourable members, 20 years after Dayton, it's time we all look ahead. And looking ahead means looking at a common future inside the European Union. The 20 years since 1995 have now proven beyond doubt that Dayton has delivered on its main objective of bringing peace and stability to Bosnia and Herzegovina and enabling post-conflict reconstruction. But many challenges remain. Much remains to be done to consolidate reconciliation. The Dayton Peace Agreement has also become fundamental to rebuilding peace and advancing reconciliation in the broader region. It has played an important part in the efforts to rebuild dialogue and cooperation in the Western Balkans. Some of the countries of the region, once enemies, have become signatories to the agreement and over time have become friends and close partners, investing in their joint future in the European Union. The Western Balkans region has moved forward a long way in the 2 decades since Dayton. Many countries of the region are candidates for EU membership, and Bosnia is a potential candidate. And Bosnia has made considerable progress in its relations in the region, in good neighbourly relations. The EU has been one of the largest donors to Bosnia, both during the war and in the post-war reconstruction period. Its presence largely focused on advancing political and economic reform and establishing a framework for the implementation of the EU stabilisation and association process following the Thessaloniki summit in June 2003 and the eventual integration of Bosnia into the EU. In addition, at the end of 2004,